Hello, I'm Chris Browder, and this is video 6.1 in a series of videos on second language acquisition theory and research. In this video, we will take a look at the role a learner's first language plays in the development of the learner's second language. This video is largely based off of Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition. It's also based on Benny, and Plonsky's text, Second Language Acquisition and Introductory Course. Let's start this discussion with the behaviorist perspective on first languages in second language acquisition. Behaviorists were the first people in academia to study this topic. And much of the contemporary research and theory is still building on their work, responding to it, reforming it, or refuting it. As you may recall from previous videos, behaviorists believed all language learning was a process of imitation, repetition, and habit formation. In this regard, first language acquisition and second language acquisition were really the same process. But behaviorists believed learning a second language was different from learning a first language only in that the habits from the first language interfered with the learning of the second. According to behaviorists, interference from the first language largely explained the challenges people have learning second languages. They believed it explained accents, errors, and all of the adults who had tried to learn a second language but never fully mastered it. In this view of SLA, the first language only played a negative role. The L1, or first language, was the enemy, and it needed to be pushed out of the way for the second language learner to succeed. That's why behaviorists recommended that translation be avoided when learning a second language. And because they viewed language learning as the formation of habits, they were particularly concerned about stopping learners from making errors by correcting them immediately, or even structuring instruction in such a way so errors could be avoided altogether. This view of SLA is largely captured in Robert Lado's Contrastive Analysis hypothesis. The Contrastive Analysis hypothesis, or CAH, asserts that all learner errors are a result of L1 interference. Therefore, all learner errors can be predicted by comparing the L1 to the L2 and identifying the differences that will cause the errors to happen. So, for example, if a student's first language is Spanish, a contrastive analysis might predict that a Spanish speaker learning English is going to make the following error. I have a shirt green. Because in Spanish, adjectives come after the nouns compared to English, which has the adjectives come before the nouns. Researchers were really excited about this theory because it promised to explain pretty much all the challenges faced by language learners and could potentially even solve all of those problems and potentially be used to design the perfect instruction so everybody could learn languages really quickly without any problem, right? So as a result, there was this flurry of research on the contrastive analysis hypothesis, tons and tons of research. The problem, however, was that this research showed that the CAH did not accurately predict all errors made by second language learners. In fact, some errors made could not be attributed to the first language at all. So, for example, let's look at some examples. The Korean language uses subject, object, verb, word order, unlike English, which is subject, verb, object. So in Korean, they say 나는 저녁을 먹었다, which translates word for word into I dinner ate. Here, I've been working with Korean English learners for nearly 30 years myself, and I don't think I've ever heard a Korean person make this type of error. My experience tells me that Koreans do, in fact, struggle to produce complete sentences in English, but they do not make this specific kind of error. Likewise, when I was learning Korean, I never made the opposite mistake for Korean. I very quickly learned that the word order in Korean was different from that of English, and I struggled to follow it. Was it more difficult for me than learning Spanish or German, which have similar word orders to English? Yeah. But could all of the actual errors I made be predicted based on the differences between Korean and English? No. Difficulty? Yeah. But errors? No. Likewise, there are certain errors that CAH predicts will not happen, but do happen. For example, Manfred Pienemann, in his research on this topic, found Germans learning English negatives such as not went through the same predictable stages as Spanish speakers do, even though German negatives are almost identical to English negatives, unlike Spanish negatives that aren't. They're very different. So you may or may not know that in English we have no and then we have not, right? So when you're changing a verb, you use not instead of no, and they do the same thing in German. They have nicht instead of nein. And so logically, this difference for English shouldn't be a problem for Germans. They should not be making sentences like, I no eat dinner. But Peinemann's research found that they did. Just like the Spanish speakers, they would go through a stage where they said, I no eat dinner instead of I didn't eat dinner or I have not eaten dinner. So, the Germans, admittedly, did pass through this stage much, much faster than the Spanish speakers did. But the fact remains, according to CAH, this error should not happen, but it does. Finally, there are some errors language learners make that simply cannot be explained by examining differences between languages. English learners will say bide instead of bought, didn't went instead of didn't go, fruits instead of fruit. In each of these cases, it appears the learner is making a mistake because he's learned a rule from English grammar, but is overgeneralizing or misapplying the English rule. Today, we SLA researchers refer to this type of error as a developmental error because it is caused by learning the L2 as opposed to being caused by L1 interference. By 1970, researchers were seeing this evidence I'm showing you now. In other words, efforts to prove the contrastive analysis hypothesis correct instead found mountains of evidence that it was not correct. For this reason, many SLA researchers started advocating for a weak version of the CIH as opposed to a strong one. Clearly, differences between the L1 and L2 did not always accurately predict and explain all of the errors made by language learners. The weak CAH conceded that only some learner errors can be explained by comparing the L1 to the L2 and identifying the differences. In other words, the weak CAH conceded that some errors cannot be explained by L1 interference. So, then what about the other errors? How do we explain them? As you may already know from my previous videos, DeLay and Bird's 1973 study found that all learners go through stages in which they make similar errors regardless of their first language. They found, for instance, that all learners drop the plural S morpheme when they first start learning English, regardless of whether their first language has a similar morpheme or not. They found that all learners will start using correct irregular past tense verbs before they start using regular past tense verbs. They found that all learners take a very long time to master the third person singular S morpheme, despite the fact that most languages have some similar system for subject verb agreement. DeLay and Burt's research ushered in a new era for second language acquisition research and theory. Contrastive analysis still plays an important role in our research on how how the first language influences the second. But our current view of this issue is much more nuanced, or shall I say, complicated. The current view on first language in SLA is that it generally plays a very positive role. When the two languages are very similar, learners can successfully borrow rules and vocabulary from their first languages to communicate in the L2. Yeah, pardon me there while I use the term L1 and L2. L1 is the first language, L2 is the second language. So, borrowing rules from the L1 to communicate in the L2 speeds up language learning a lot. In this view, the L1 is seen as a resource the learner can draw upon when struggling to communicate in the L2. And the use of the L1 to communicate in L2 is viewed as a kind of a clever strategy instead of a mindless habit or a problem that must be avoided. Obviously, the rules and vocabulary from one language don't always work perfectly with the L2. Sometimes they cause errors, but this is no longer viewed as a threat to the learner. We no longer fear these errors will become bad habits if not immediately corrected. We believe the learners will learn the correct forms when they're ready to. SLA researchers no longer discuss the role of the L1 using the derogatory term interference. We now use this more neutral term transfer, L1 transfer. L1 transfer can be classified as positive or negative. It is important to note that the difference between positive and negative transfer is not the L1 form itself, but is the result of the transfer. So you can't look at the form, like the L1 form, and say that this is going to be negative or positive. Instead, you look at the result. Did it help or did it hurt? So if the transfer speeds up learning or enables the learner to communicate, then it's positive. If the learner causes an error or slows down the learning, then it is negative. Interestingly, sometimes it's both. And I'll explain that more later. In fact, I think usually it's both. Positive transfer is when a similarity between the L1 and the L2 means learners can take features of their L1 and apply them to communicate correctly in the L2. Spanish, for example, has the same syntax as English, subject, verb, object. So, like, I eat the apple. Technically, a Spanish speaker can often form a coherent sentence in English simply by translating the words in a Spanish sentence word for word. And that helps a lot. Likewise, Spanish has many cognates with English. Cognates are words that are very similar in both languages. Family in English is familia in Spanish. And this is obviously a huge advantage for Spanish speakers learning English. Negative transfer, in contrast, is when a difference between the L1 and L2 causes learners to make errors or learn more slowly. For example, in English, we change our negatives when they're used with verbs. So we say, I'm not going to the party instead of I'm no going to the party in Spanish. However, they don't need to change the negative to use it with a verb. Therefore, if a Spanish speaker uses the Spanish grammar to form English sentences, and they say stuff like, I no like seafood, and that would be a negative transfer. Researchers on modern contrastive analysis have created what they call a hierarchy of difficulty. The hierarchy shows many ways languages can be similar or different, and how each different kind of difference, causes different levels of challenge for the learner. The lowest level, level 0, is just simple transfer. That is when an L1 feature can simply be applied to correctly communicate in the L1 as it is, or maybe just with some slight changes. Both the Spanish and the English language, for example, use a final S morpheme to mark their nouns as plural. And since the two forms are so similar, Spanish speakers can use their Spanish grammar to form plurals in English. So in English, for example, book becomes books. In Spanish, libro becomes libros. This easy level, where you would just have this very easy positive transfer because they're just almost exactly the same. This easy level can be contrasted with a higher level, such as level 4, which is called over-differentiation. With over-differentiation, the L1 is simply missing the form that the learner needs to learn for the L2. Like they just don't have anything to transfer at all. They just don't have it. An example of this would be maybe a Russian speaker trying to learn how to use English articles. Articles are and the, like the dog and an apple. Russian has no articles. Since Russian has no articles, a Russian speaker might struggle to learn this for a very long time and might never get it at all. You might have noticed this with some Russian people learning English, that they just can't handle the articles. Koreans have the same problem. Interestingly, the highest level of difficulty in the hierarchy is when the L1 has one form that is represented as several different forms in the L2. So an example of this is when Spanish speakers are trying to learn the English possessive pronouns your, his, her, its, their. We have all these different possessive pronouns, right? But these are all represented as one word in Spanish. In Spanish, they just have su. All right. So they've got to learn to turn this su into all these different things. So they've got to be paying attention to this. Like, okay, is this singular? Is this plural? Is this masculine? Is this feminine? That's hard for them. As you can see from the hierarchy of difficulty, the contemporary view of transfer can be very complicated. But sadly, I've only just begun to show you examples of how complicated it can be. So let's continue. An example of this complication is found in the similarity differential rate hypothesis. This hypothesis claims there can be both positive and negative transfer when an L1 form is very similar to an L2 form. This is because the transfer of an L1 form can start out as something positive because it enables communication and speeds up learning, but eventually it becomes something like a crutch for the learner. For example, the Spanish language has its own R sound. That's like a right? But it is not exactly the same as the American English R sound. In fact, I think Spanish has two different R sounds. And they're both very different from the American English R sound. It's really very hard, very R, especially when you get down south, like into Arkansas. When Spanish speakers are first learning English, they can use that Spanish R sound to pronounce English words with an R, like Arkansas, right? They end up sounding like Antonio Banderas. Later, however, the use of the Spanish style R when speaking English can linger for a long time as an accent that might never become native-like. That's because the Spanish R sound is so similar to the American English R sound that, well, it doesn't really need to be corrected. In this example, we can see that a similarity that initially causes positive transfer becomes a negative transfer in the form of a lingering accent. Thus, similarities between two languages can lead to some of the most persistent learner errors. This is an interesting phenomenon because notice how the transfer was originally viewed as positive, and then the very same transfer is later viewed as negative. Like first it's good because it speeds up the learning, and then later on we think it's a problem. The similarity differential rate hypothesis is a major change in the way we view L1 transfer because it helps us to realize that we cannot simply classify all transfers either positive or negative. Maybe this whole positive negative thing is like one big false dichotomy. Maybe transfer is neither positive or negative. Maybe just transfer is just transfer. Another contemporary theory on L1 transfer is the theory of sorry. Another contemporary theory on L1 transfer is the theory of language distance. This theory is very similar to the similarity differential rate hypothesis. Language distance theory proposes that much more transfer will happen when the first language and the second language are very similar. But the transfer can be both positive and negative, which is kind of what I was saying before, right? This means there will be both more positive and more negative transfer when the two languages are similar. Faster learning, but also more transfer errors. To illustrate this, we can compare a German speaker learning English with a Korean speaker learning English. A German speaker will learn English very quickly because he can apply much of what he uses for German to learn English. But he might have more L1 transfer errors because he's using German phonemes, morphemes, syntax, pragmatics, etc. to form his utterances in English. So for a German person, a word like have might be pronounced as haf, for example, because he's using his German phonemes to pronounce English words. He can correct this, but might not correct it if he feels he doesn't need to. A Korean speaker, in contrast, can transfer very little from his language to learn English. Therefore, the Korean speaker will learn English much more slowly and struggle for a very long time. But when he learns English, however, he's unlikely to have errors caused by transfer because his problem is not transfer, his problem is a lack of transfer. He'll make a lot of errors, but they won't be caused by first language. Instead, they'd be caused by overgeneralizing, misunderstanding, or misapplying a rule he's learning in English, which is what we call developmental errors. So, in this view, again, transfer is neither positive nor negative. It's just transfer. It speeds up learning, but it causes errors. So, another difference is I think traditionally, if you don't have a similar form in your first language and you're trying to learn it in the second language, traditionally that would be called L1 interference, right? Or negative transfer. In this theory, they wouldn't blame it on the first language at all. They would just say, well, it's not transfer. It has nothing to do with the first language. It's just simply this person can't transfer it. So, like a Korean person trying to learn articles in English, he has nothing to transfer. So, the problem would really be, according to this view, a developmental problem because he's having trouble learning the second language, not a transfer problem because he's not really transferring anything. Sorry if that's confusing. I don't know. I hope that helps. So, so a lot of these theories I'm giving you now, they might seem to be complicating what you know about the role of the first language. And it might be a little overwhelming for you. There are all these different theories and they're so complicated. Part of the problem is maybe a bit of cognitive dissonance on your part because most of our societies have this behaviorist view where all your problems are caused by your first language and you get the first language out of the way and everything's going to be fine. And when you go on the internet, you can find all kinds of people telling you that. Research shows that that's not true. So you got to get over this commonly held belief, get over that commonly held belief, and instead brace the actual science because sometimes science and the commonly held belief is not the same. It takes a while for the commonly held belief to catch up with the science, okay? Then, secondly, I would recommend that you just look into your own life, look into your own experience, like look at yourself when you're learning a second language and what's actually really causing the differences, and make your own decision about what makes sense to you, and grab the theory that works for you. Okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, contrastive analysis stumbled around 1970 because researchers found they could not predict errors based on differences between L1 and L2. Sometimes the transfer happened and sometimes it just didn't. This realization ushered in an era of research aimed at understanding why learners sometimes transferred forms from their L1 and sometimes didn't. And so let's talk about that next. The question here is, are learners making actual choices when they're transferring? Are they choosing to transfer one thing and then choosing not to transfer another? One theory that attempts to explain this decision to transfer or not transfer form is the morphological congruency hypothesis. Whoosh. This hypothesis proposes that learners feel the need to find and use L2 forms that are similar to the forms they have in their L1. This causes them to be faster to consciously notice the form in the L2 that is similar to the one that they have in the L1, and it causes them to try to use the L2 form more consistently because they feel they need it. So, like, in other words, if you have something in your first language and then you're learning a second language, you feel you need it in the second language, and you're actually, like, looking for it. Like, you're trying to speak in the second language and you're like, oh, I need a plural. How do I do plurals? How do I do plurals? So, like, Russians, for example, will learn English plurals faster because they have a similar plural morpheme in the Russian language. And as a result, they feel the need to have a plural morpheme when they're using English. So they look for it, notice it, pay attention to it, and make more effort to use it. Japanese, in contrast, does not have a plural morpheme. And as a result, Japanese speakers will learn English plurals much more slowly. They simply don't feel the need to have plurals when using English because they don't use them in Japanese. They don't feel something's missing. So they're less likely to notice the English plurals. They're less likely to pay attention to the English plurals, and they're less likely to use them consistently. I actually kind of had the opposite experience when I was trying to learn the Thai language. The Thai language also does not have a plural morpheme. They don't feel the need to have plurals. And that just really bothered me. I just remember just being really bothered by the fact that I couldn't pluralize things. And then they showed me kind of like a different way to do it that wasn't using a morpheme. And then I started doing that and they all laughed at me because I was overusing it. And they thought I was being silly. like, why are you doing that? Okay. So, what makes the morphological congruency hypothesis so important for SLA is that it gives us some insight into the mind of the learner. I'm sorry that this complicates things, but this is important. Whereas behaviorists explain this transfer process in terms of just mindless habits that need to be broken, this theory explains it in terms of noticing, attention, and the learner's feelings or beliefs or expectations about languages in general. It recognizes that the learner is intelligent and making choices. And that explains why sometimes the transfer happens and sometimes doesn't. Next, the markedness differential hypothesis. This one gets a bit cryptical. I'm sorry. This is yet another theory that explains and complicates our standard theories of L1 transfer. Like the morphological congruency hypothesis, it attempts to explain why certain forms get transferred and others don't. This theory is based on Chomsky's theory of universal grammar, which was Chomsky's observation that certain forms are are universal among languages, while others are less common. He called those less common forms, he called them marked forms, which is why we get this markedness theory, okay? As you might recall from earlier videos, Chomsky showed that children acquire the universal forms much faster than the other forms and acquire the marked or rare forms last. The markedness differential hypothesis basically promotes the same idea with transfer. It applies it to transfer theory to explain why some forms get transferred and some forms don't, or why some forms are transferred faster than others. Just basically, the universal forms transfer very quickly. The marked forms transfer very slowly. The learners are not comfortable transferring marked forms. This hypothesis suggests that learners have some ideas or intuitions or feelings about what is more likely or less likely to work in another language, and are making choices about what to transfer based on some ideas and intuitions that they have about languages in general. An illustration of this would be something called preposition stranding. English is one of the few languages that allow for preposition stranding. In other words, in English, we can use a preposition at the end of a sentence. Now, I know your English teachers told you this is bad grammar and that you're not supposed to do it, but we all do it. And that's a fact. People speaking English do it. So it's a rule of the English language, regardless of what your English teachers tell you. So let me give you an example. The question, who did you give it to? Who did you give it to? Notice to is at the end of the sentence. That's something we do in English, and other languages just don't do that. Now, an English teacher would tell you that you're supposed to say, to whom did you give it? But we don't really do that. That's not the real English that's not the English I use. Okay. So, yeah, so the interesting thing is we English speakers, we do this in our own language, but when we're learning other languages, we don't transfer this preposition stranding to other languages. It just doesn't transfer for some reason or other, and people using other languages will have real difficulty learning to do the preposition stranding in English. So somehow our decisions to transfer our L1 to our L2 are being affected by some ideas or intuitions or feelings we have about languages in general. And these intuitions we have might somehow be rooted in universal grammar. Another very similar theory about L1 transfer is prototypicality theory. Prototypicality theory proposes that certain words have a pure or prototype form and also have a less pure or idiomatic form. So let me illustrate this with the word cover, okay? The word cover in English has a literal meaning, like when I say, please cover the pot with a lid, right? But cover also has an idiomatic meaning. Like when one worker asks another worker, can you cover my shift tonight? Research on prototypicality theory shows that a language learner would be likely to use his L1 to translate the literal form of the word, but not likely to use his L1 to translate the idiomatic form of the word. So, for example, SLA researcher Eric Kellerman found that Dutch people learning English were willing to use the English word break the same way they would use the Dutch word breken in a sentence, like he broke his leg. Breken. That's the literal form. And they would do that. They would translate that word for word. But they were reluctant to use the word idiomatically, like in the sentence, the police broke the strike, or I woke up at the break of dawn. And this was interesting because in Dutch, they have these same idiomatic uses of the word breken that we have in our word broke. but for some reason, they're just not comfortable transferring the idiomatic form. So again, notice how this theory assumes learners make intelligent choices about L1 transfer based on ideas or intuitions they have about languages. Like sometimes they just don't do the transfer because they say, "Yeah, that doesn't feel right," or maybe that seems weird, So there are other factors that seem to decide whether the learner is going to transfer an L1 form. Researchers, for instance, have found that L1 transfer errors vary according to the context. Learners, for example, will be more careful about using their L1 to support their L2 in certain more formal situations, but in other more casual situations, they might relax and take more risks when using pieces of their L1 to support their L2. Interestingly, tasks that allow time for planning will elicit more transfer because the learner will have more time to use translator aids such as bilingual dictionaries, websites, and apps. Again, transfer can be both positive or negative, largely depending on our point of view. A learner's decision or ability to transfer an L1 form to the L2 may also depend on mental processing power. As you may know from previous videos, Pieneman's processability theory proposes that humans have limited processing power for language. In this theory, forming sentences in a second language is like learning to juggle. At first, there's a limit to what learners can process in a sentence, and this explains why they usually make so many developmental errors in the early stages of learning. Eventually, as they practice more and the other forms become more automatic, they free up more processing power for trying out other things. And one of the things that they try to do is transferring L1 forms to the L2. According to Pieneman, this is the point at which learners start trying to transfer more of their L1 to their L2. So back to this example of the Germans, they remember they should know the difference between no and not, right? Because they have the exact same thing in their language. And Pieneman found that they went through a stage where they just used no for everything, and just like the Spanish speakers. That's a developmental error. It's not a transfer error. It's not explained with German because German is the same as English in that regard. But eventually they stop doing it and they learn how to positively transfer that German word nicht to the English word not. Now, I want you to notice that this seems to contradict Selinker's original idea about interlanguages. Remember, the original idea of interlanguages is that they start off as the L1 and they gradually lose the features of the L1 as they gain the features of the L2. Pieneman's research shows that's not quite true. That first they go through this developmental stage where they just don't transfer anything, and then eventually they start transferring. Age. Researchers have found that the age of the language learner also affects L1 transfer. Researchers have found that children rely much less on their first language when learning their second language than adults do. As the L1 becomes more established, it is more likely to be used as a resource for second language acquisition. This is especially true for vocabulary and literacy. This is why adults can learn a second language much, much faster at first than children do. But this is also why the adults have these long-lasting errors. So they're transferring more, they're benefiting more, and they're also hurt more in the long run from those transfer errors. Last but not least, culture. Culture also affects L1 transfer. One example of this is pragmatic transfer. Pragmatics, in case you don't know, is the study of language rules that govern how and when we use certain language forms or actions. So, for example, pragmatics explains, why, like, when is it appropriate to say thank you? When is it appropriate to say I'm sorry? When is it appropriate to give advice or a suggestion or a compliment? Rules such as these vary a great deal from culture to culture and can cause a lot of negative pragmatic transfer. So, for example, in English, when you're trying to get out of the subway, you say, "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." If you translate that into Japanese or Korean and you're saying, excuse me, or I'm sorry in Korean or Japanese, they're going to be like, sorry for what? What did you fart or something? Why are you apologizing? Or why are you asking me to excuse you? What do you want? And they're really not going to know. They're not going to understand. You need them to get out of the way because they have a different way of doing that in their language. We have different ways of using language, and sometimes things just don't translate. So let's talk about Japanese. In Japanese, the Japanese people apologize constantly. They're constantly saying "I'm sorry" in Japanese. Japanese people will even apologize after eating a good meal. Like they'll apologize because they enjoyed something too much. Now imagine if a Japanese person is doing this in English, like you invite them to dinner and they're eating and apologizing, like "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." You're gonna think that person is like, a little strange. You might misunderstand and think that something else is wrong. Another example of cultural differences is conceptual transfer. Sometimes a language will have a concept that other languages just simply don't have. Words in one language don't always translate well into other languages, and sometimes they just don't translate at all. This can be a challenge for language learners. An example of this I've found in my own learning and working with Korean learners of English is the word chaemyeon in Korean. This is a really important word for the Korean language, but it has absolutely no translation in English. Now, if you were to try to translate it, if you were to use a dictionary or whatever, it's going to give you these words like merit, honor, esteem. But those words are very different from chaemyeon because like a word like esteem so chaemyeon is similar to those words, but chaemyeon is something that you share with the different groups that you belong to. Maybe a little more similar to honor, but still it's something that you give to your family. It's like you do something good or you do something that you should be proud of, but instead of you being proud of it as an individual, instead you share that pride with all your friends, and all your friends are feeling that pride with you. They're benefiting from your achievement. And that's really because English is just a very individualistic language and Korean is a very collectivistic language. They're not doing things for themselves. They're doing things for others. So when a Korean person says something like, "This school has good merit," he's probably trying to transfer this concept of chaemyeon, but it just doesn't transfer. It's going to sound very strange when he does. You don't say this school has good merit. That's just weird. We can redirect that learner. We can say, yeah, maybe you could say this school is held in very high esteem, but it still doesn't capture the real meaning of chaemyeon in this extremely collectivistic culture that is Korea. Researchers have suggested that this pragmatic and conceptual transfer can be perhaps the most difficult thing of all for adult learners because for adults, it actually poses a threat to their identity and values. Like what I was talking about, the difference between individualism and collectivism in Korea. In Korea, if you're doing things individualistically, they might think you're selfish. And in America, if you're doing things collectivistically, they'll think you're weak or a conformist or that you don't think for yourself, they'll think you're immature. Um, your first language is how you express your identity. It's how you express your gender. It's how you express your views on equality. It's how you express your religious faith. And it's so much more. It's how you show that you're like a functional, contributing adult. And that's how you show you're a good person and not a bad person, right? When you're challenged to do everything differently in a different language, all those things are threatened. So, to summarize this whole video, let's get this down to a few simple statements that you can walk away with, okay? Because I know this is a lot and you're probably feeling overwhelmed. As you can see, not only do we no longer view the first language as a problem for second language learners, but we actually have come to view it as a resource that learners can draw upon. When the two languages are very similar, it is easier to draw from the first language for the second language, and that causes both positive and negative transfer. In fact, the negative, positive thing, they're all kind of the same thing. Transfer is just transfer. In fact, the similarities between two different languages can cause the most long-lasting errors. So it's not the differences that cause the long-lasting problems, it's the similarities. We also understand now that learners make calculating decisions about when to draw on their L1. So in other words, transfer, it's more like a strategy than a habit. It's not some mindless thing like a habit you got to break, like you got to stop twitching or you got to stop shaking your leg, got to stop picking your nose or whatever. It's a choice you make based on your beliefs and your feelings about language, like what you feel a language needs or doesn't need. And we also know that using the L1 can greatly speed up second language acquisition. But like other shortcuts in life, it can have drawbacks. A survival strategy or a coping strategy can become a lingering issue. But like any other persistent error in second language acquisition, it can be overcome by a motivated and supported learner. So we no longer believe that we need to plan out our lessons in a way in order to avoid errors. We don't need to worry about that. It's not like, when you make an error and you're driving a car, somebody gets killed. It's usually not like that with language. All right. Now, I hope this video helped you. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.